Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we'll examine the complex and enduring tensions between India and Pakistan. We'll explore the historical roots of this conflict, tracing its evolution from the partition of 1947 to the present day. We'll examine key moments of heightened tension, including wars and significant political changes, with a particular focus on the contentious region of Kashmir. We'll also discuss the role of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP, in shaping India's foreign policy towards Pakistan. Finally, we'll consider the future of this conflict between two nuclear-armed nations, especially in the context of China's growing influence in the region. My guest today is Gopalan Balachandran, co-director of the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy and honorary professor of international history and politics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. So Bala, thank you again for joining us for this episode of What Matters Today. I'm going to just jump in with the first question. Can you take us briefly through the history of Kashmir on the eve of partition?
Thank you, Dan. As always, it's a pleasure to be here. So when we think of Kashmir, we think of it essentially as a conflict between India and Pakistan. And it's indeed a conflict that goes back to the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. But there is another dimension to it, which I think is important for us to keep in mind. Kashmir is one of four states which had, as it were, a troubled history of accession to India or Pakistan. And in some of these cases, the key driver of the accession really were peasant rebellions in those states, which to some extent so weakened the rulers that it kind of tilted the balance in favor of accession. And in Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir used to be ruled by a Maharaja or a king, Dalip Singh, whose ancestors basically bought Jammu and Kashmir from the Sikh rulers who had to pay an indemnity to the East India Company as a result of losing a war. And the rulers thought that they owned the Vale of Kashmir, and most of the peasants there were in fact their serfs and tributaries. What happens in the 1930s is that there is a very strong peasant movement in Kashmir. The peasants are mostly Muslims. The Maharaja is a Hindu. The peasants are led by the Lion of Kashmir, Sheikh Abdullah. And from the 1930s through the 1940s, you have an upsurge in peasant mobilization with Sheikh Abdullah at the head. But come 1947, the context of partition between India and Pakistan, this issue becomes somewhat reconfigured as a conflict between Muslim peasants and a Hindu ruler who also plays the game by financing Hindu nationalist parties such as the Hindu Mahasabha and the Bharatiya Jan Sangh, which is in fact the precursor to the modern day BJP. So the issue takes a communal dimension in 1947, and the communal dimension is heightened by the partition and, of course, the conflict that emerges as a result of Pakistan raiders invading Jammu and Kashmir in 1947.
And India and Pakistan fought a war, the first of many over the next few decades, over Kashmir in 1947, 1948. What was the outcome of that war, and how did it affect Kashmir?
So, as Maharaja Hari Singh was, as it were, trying to figure out what he wanted to do, be independent, would he accede to India, would he accede to Kashmir? The problem with acceding to India, he felt, was that his privileges as a Maharaja would be curtailed because the National Conference was close to the Congress Party. Sheikh Abdullah was close to Jawaharlal Nehru. The problem with acceding to Pakistan, of course, was that the outcome was uncertain. Whilst he was trying to see whether he could hold on to his independence, quote unquote, Pakistan sends in raiders and in fact some elements even of their regular army to try and take over Jammu and Kashmir. The raiders are stopped at a particular place, but Maharaja Hari Singh then signs an instrument of accession to India under the pressure, as it were, of the raid. And at the moment that India takes the issue to the Security Council, Pakistan controls some part of the territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which it now refers to as Azad or Free Kashmir, and which India refers to as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. And that's pretty much the status quo that has remained since 1948 as a result of the UN Security Council resolution. India and Pakistan do fight a war over Kashmir in 1965. In 1971, the dividing line becomes the line of control, but the status quo is one that has prevailed pretty much since 1947-48 of the two countries occupying different parts of Kashmir, which they claim as their own.
And to what extent was the Cold War a factor in the Kashmir conflict?
Despite India and Pakistan fighting a war over Kashmir in 1947-48, ties between the two countries in the at least the early 1950s were much closer than they were to be subsequently. In the mid-1950s, the Pakistani military, which is predominantly derives its power base from Punjab, becomes increasingly powerful, and Pakistan begins to see itself as a state that could derive some benefits from taking sides in the Cold War. India was non-aligned, as we all well know, and Pakistan saw an advantage in taking sides in the Cold War and becoming, as it were, a frontline US ally in Asia. And that, in a way, deepens the antagonism between the two sides and transforming the issue into some kind of a zero-sum game rather than one which could have been negotiated over. And so, yeah, the Cold War was a critical element in cementing, as it were, the conflict.
Yet the end of the Cold War coincided with an upsurge in militancy in Kashmir.
Yeah, that's indeed a bit of a paradox, but there were also several other things that were happening at this time that contributed to the upsurge in militancy in Kashmir. One contributing factor was, of course, the story of broken promises from the Indian side. One of the conditions of the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India was that Jammu and Kashmir would retain a large element of autonomy. In the original agreement, only defense, communications, and foreign affairs vested in the government in Delhi. All the other powers vested in the government in Srinagar. And this was secured through a constitutional article, Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. But over a period of time, the powers became more centralized. And despite Article 370 existing in the Constitution, in very large measure, Jammu and Kashmir was, in most substantive aspects, no different from other states of the Indian Union. And this was a cause of resentment through the 1950s and 1960s. Part of the arrangement through which this outcome was produced was by jailing and marginalizing Sheikh Abdullah, who's placed under house arrest in 1953 for conspiring against India and remains in various forms of detention until the mid-1970s. But what really tips the scales is in elections in 1987, which were widely thought to be rigged in favor of the Congress government in Delhi. And the rigging of the elections, in a way, seems to defeat the Indian narrative that Kashmir was part of a democratic system and then part of India, and had made its decisions through multiple elections and made its choices freely. So the upsurge in militancy coincides also at the same time with the growth of certain kinds of Islamic militancy in Afghanistan, funded by the US, funded by Saudi Arabia, and so on. And so the whole subcontinent is caught up in a vortex, as it were, of Islamic militancy, which to some extent is channeled towards Kashmir, where a largely secular or non-sectarian resistance to Indian domination or non-sectarian demand for more powers to Jammu and Kashmir gets transmuted, as it were, into some kind of an Islamic militancy that rages through the 1990s. Partly with support from Pakistan, which can see that it has much to benefit by stoking an insurgency in Kashmir, and Pakistan is determined to give the insurgency an Islamic, tone, and that eventually begins to dominate.
And how would you assess New Delhi's Kashmir policy since the 1990s?
I think the policy that New Delhi adopts is one of repressing extremist elements in the movement in the hope of strengthening the moderates and in the hope of being able to arrive at a negotiated settlement with the more moderate elements represented still by the National Conference and one or two other parties. But, repression can sometimes become indiscriminate. Repression deepens bitterness, deepens resentment. The repression also, to a great extent, weakened the moderates who were championing, staying with India and championing the idea of Jammu and Kashmir as a part of India. What we refer to as Jammu and Kashmir as three components: Jammu, which is majority Hindu, Kashmir, which is majority Muslim, and Ladakh, which is dominated by Buddhists. And basically any government in Delhi had to balance the interests of the three regions and couldn't be seen to be succumbing to the demands of extremists in Kashmir. So that kind of totally complicates the equation between the three regions and between Jammu and Kashmir and Delhi throughout the 1990s and the subsequent decades. So New Delhi's policy is essentially one of keep the moderates on its side whilst quelling the insurgency. And it begins to taste success in the early 2000s and till about the early 2010s.
And that brings us to the recent outrage and the Modi's government's response to it. Where do they leave us now on Kashmir?
The terrorist outrage in Pahalgam, according to most accounts, followed a period of relative calm in terms of terrorist incidents in Jammu and Kashmir. But the background to this is that in 2019, when Modi's returned to power with a larger majority, takes the opportunity to repeal Article 370, which has been a long-standing demand of the Bharatiya Jansangh and later the Bharatiya Janata Party. Ladakh is one union territory, is converted into one union, Jammu and Kashmir into another, and the two regions are now ruled directly from Delhi. That deepens alienation in Kashmir. The repeal of Article 370 is accompanied by multiplying security forces in Kashmir, imposing an internet clampdown, and so on and so forth. But over the last 2 or 3 years, many of these things were being relaxed, and there was a semblance of normalcy returning to Kashmir, even though the underlying issues continued to simmer, even though the resentment of the Kashmiri people had only deepened because of certain changes in rules relating to domicile and so on, which are too complicated to get into now. No people can withstand long years of repression without a desire to restore some kind of normalcy. And that was what was beginning to happen. Tourism was beginning to increase very largely from India. And many in India, including the government, saw the restoration of tourism as a sign of return to normalcy. So in this backdrop, the attack on the predominantly Indian tourists in Pahalgam, some of whom were killed because of their religious identity, caused tremendous outrage in India. But as much as in India, within Kashmir, there was a great deal of sorrow in Kashmir. The first responders were actually local Kashmiris who were trying to, who went to the rescue, as it were, of these tourists and tried to arrange for their evacuation, medical attention, providing them food, care and shelter and so on until more organized efforts could be made. So there was outrage in India, deep sorrow, Kashmir. At the same time, I think the government felt called upon to respond to the attack by blaming Pakistan, where in fact these terrorists continue to have their camps and training facilities and so on, though, no direct evidence was ever produced of Pakistan's implication in this particular incident. And so as public pressure in India built up, the government responded by bombing, by in a way, the terrorist training camps in Punjab, which then evoked a response from Pakistan and culminated in a 4 or 5 day conflict, which seems for now to have been paused on both sides. I think we tend to think of it as a ceasefire mandated or mediated by the United States. As far as the Indian government is concerned, it's a pause in hostilities, and should something like this happen again, we don't know what might erupt in the subcontinent, where both India and Pakistan are, two nuclear-armed countries with quite powerful armies.
Bala, thank you very much. That was my last question, but again, thank you for your valuable insights on such a complex situation.
Thank you, Dan. It is, in fact, very, very complex, and I hope we've tried to make some sense of it in this conversation. Thank you.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.